The first thing Charlotte Hayes heard after her newborn son cried wasn't "congratulations." It was the quiet click of a leather briefcase opening. Still weak from labor, her body trembling beneath crisp, white hospital sheets, at Mount Sinai on the Upper East Side, Charlotte turned her head slowly toward the sound. Outside the floor-to-ceiling window, the Manhattan skyline glowed in early morning gray. Inside the room, everything felt colder than the December air beyond the glass. Her son lay against her chest, barely an hour old. Nathaniel Carrington stood at the foot of her bed. He wasn't looking at the baby. He wasn't looking at her either. Instead, his mother, Eleanor Carrington, stepped forward in a tailored cream coat that probably cost more than the average New Yorker's rent. She placed a thick stack of documents gently, almost politely, on the rolling hospital tray beside Charlotte's untouched water cup and her iPhone. "We think it's best to handle this now," Eleanor said, her voice smooth, rehearsed. Charlotte blinked, still foggy from exhaustion. "Handle what?" Nathan's jaw tightened. He adjusted the cuff of his Rolex, eyes flickering briefly toward the infant, before returning to the window. "It's a divorce petition," he said flatly. "My attorneys prepared it last week." Last week, before she went into labor. The words didn't hit all at once. They settled slowly, like snow covering something already broken. Eleanor continued, as if discussing a catering change at a gala. "The timing isn't ideal, but neither is this situation. Nathan's company is weeks from its NASDAQ listing. We can't afford instability." Instability. Charlotte looked down at her son's tiny fingers curling instinctively around her hospital bracelet. They thought she was the liability. They thought she was the weak one. What they didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the woman they were trying to discard had quietly inherited controlling interest in a private investment empire that could swallow Nathan's company whole. And as the nurse stepped back into the room, unaware of the war just declared, Charlotte slowly reached for a pen. Charlotte didn't sign. Not immediately. She shifted slightly against the hospital pillows, wincing as pain radiated through her abdomen. Her son stirred softly against her chest, unaware that his first hour in the world had already become a negotiation. "You're serious," she said quietly. Nathan exhaled. "I am patient." "Lottie, don't make this dramatic. This is strategic." Strategic. The word echoed in the sterile room, louder than the soft beeping of the heart monitor beside her bed. Eleanor clasped her hands together, posture flawless. "Nathan's company is preparing for its NASDAQ debut in 3 weeks. Investors value stability. A postpartum wife from a modest background who doesn't attend board dinners or charity galas. That creates questions." Charlotte blinked slowly. "I was on bed rest." "Yes," Eleanor replied smoothly, "and optics matter." Nathan finally looked at her directly, not with cruelty, not even anger, just calculation. "Victoria's family is backing the second round of funding. Her father sits on 2 major investment boards. This merger could double our valuation before listing." Victoria. The name hovered between them like perfume Charlotte never wore. "So this is about positioning," Charlotte whispered. "It's about growth," Nathan corrected. "You deserve a quiet settlement, a generous one. Brooklyn townhouse, monthly support. We'll set up a trust for the baby." The baby. He still hadn't touched his son. Charlotte felt something inside her harden, not break, but settle into place. "And custody?" she asked. Eleanor's eyes flickered. "Primary custody will remain with the Carrington name. Of course you'll have visitation." Visitation. For the child she had carried for 9 months. The child whose tiny heartbeat she memorized during every ultrasound. "You planned this before I gave birth," Charlotte said softly. Nathan didn't deny it. "Timing matters in business." silence stretched between them. Outside, the traffic crawled along Fifth Avenue. Life moved. Markets opened. Numbers shifted on screens and glass towers. Inside the hospital room, a different transaction was unfolding. Charlotte adjusted her grip on her son as he whimpered. She looked at Nathan, not as a husband, but as a man making a deal he believed he had already won. "Leave the papers," she said calmly. Eleanor raised a brow. "You'll sign?" Charlotte's voice didn't tremble. "I'll respond." Charlotte was discharged 48 hours later. There were no flowers waiting, no Carrington family driver, no public statement celebrating the birth of an heir. Only a black car service she ordered herself through an app on her iPhone. The December air cut sharply against her skin as the nurse helped her into the back seat. She held her newborn close, wrapped carefully in a soft gray blanket the hospital provided. The city smelled like cold metal and exhaust, like Manhattan always did before Christmas. Nathan hadn't called. Eleanor hadn't texted. The divorce document sat in her leather tote bag beside a packet of discharge instructions and a bottle of prescribed pain medication. As the car moved south along Fifth Avenue, Charlotte stared out at storefront windows, dressed in gold and crystal. Cartier lights glittered. Saks displayed winter gowns beneath artificial snow. Life looked polished, untouched. Inside the vehicle, her world had just been erased. Her son stirred, making a small sound in his sleep. Charlotte brushed her finger gently across his cheek. "I've got you," she whispered. Not a promise to the world, just to him. The car stopped in front of a temporary furnished apartment in Brooklyn Heights. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet. Private. No doormen reporting her movements to society pages. After settling the baby into a borrowed bassinet, Charlotte sat at the small dining table. The room still smelled faintly of new paint and unopened Amazon boxes stacked against the wall. She opened her MacBook Air. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard for a long moment. Then she typed a single email. Subject line, "It's time." Recipient, Andrew Calloway. There were no emotional paragraphs, no accusations, just 3 sentences. "They filed for divorce before our son was born. They're seeking primary custody. I need to activate contingency clause 17. She hit send. Within 30 seconds, her phone vibrated. Andrew never missed important messages, and his reply was brief. "Understood. Do not sign anything. I'll be in Manhattan by morning." Charlotte closed the laptop slowly. Across the East River, financial towers shimmered under the night sky. Somewhere in one of those buildings, markets moved because of families like hers. Nathan believed he had removed a liability. He had no idea he had just triggered a mechanism far larger than his IPO. Andrew Calloway arrived before sunrise. Charlotte heard the soft knock at 6:12 a.m., just as pale winter light crept through the Brooklyn Heights windows. She had barely slept. The baby stirred beside her on the couch, wrapped securely against her chest. Andrew stepped inside, wearing a navy overcoat and carrying a slim leather portfolio. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his posture calm but alert, the same way it had been for the past 20 years as chief financial officer of Hayes Global Holdings. He didn't waste time on small talk. "I assumed they'd move before the IPO," he said quietly. "I didn't expect them to do it in a hospital room." Charlotte gave a faint, tired smile. "They called it strategic." Andrew's jaw tightened. "They always do." He set the portfolio on the table and opened it. Inside were documents most people in Manhattan would never see. Trust agreements, equity allocations, private holding structures tied to discrete office towers along Park Avenue. "Contingency Clause 17, Andrew continued. "It was written by your father after the Carrington acquisition attempt 12 years ago." Charlotte looked up. "The failed one?" "Failed publicly," Andrew corrected. "So not privately." He slid a document toward her. If any direct heir of Hayes Global is threatened with financial destabilization, coercive divorce litigation, or custody manipulation that risks legacy assets, control authority can be activated early. Charlotte felt her pulse slow. My trust isn't accessible until I'm 32. Normally, Andrew said, but if the heir is legally targeted in a way that could transfer influence outside the bloodline, the board can override the age restriction. She stared at the fine print. Nathan believed she was financially dependent. Eleanor believed she could intimidate her into signing. Neither of them knew the Carrington name had once tried, and failed, to absorb Hayes Global during a quiet market downturn years ago. Andrew folded his hands. They don't realize who you are because you chose anonymity. That was your right. Charlotte looked down at her son, his tiny fingers curling instinctively. What happens if we activate it? She asked. Andrew's voice was steady. Hayes Global becomes visible. He paused. And once we're visible, Charlotte, we don't defend. We acquire. 3 nights later, Nathan Carrington stood beneath the bright studio lights of CNBC, adjusting his cufflinks, while a production assistant clipped a microphone to his lapel. Behind him, a large digital screen displayed the Carrington FinTech logo beside a scrolling NASDAQ ticker. His navy suit was tailored perfectly. The Rolex on his wrist caught the light every time he gestured. He looked composed, victorious. Carrington FinTech is positioned to disrupt legacy banking models, he told the anchor smoothly. We're bringing stability and innovation to a volatile market. Stability. The word felt almost rehearsed. Across town at the River Cafe, reservations were impossible to secure on short notice. But Victoria Langford never had that problem. She sat across from Nathan later that evening, Manhattan's skyline shimmering behind her like a curated backdrop. To us, she said lightly, lifting her champagne glass, and to a valuation that finally reflects your ambition. Nathan smiled, clinking his glass against hers. Victoria's father had already committed to a major investment block, pending IPO performance. The alliance wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It was strategic, mutually beneficial, polished. Exactly the kind of partnership Eleanor approved of. Charlotte signed? Victoria asked casually, cutting into her dinner. Not yet, Nathan replied, though his tone suggested inevitability. She doesn't have the leverage to fight this. Victoria studied him for a moment. Women with nothing usually fight the hardest. Nathan dismissed the comment with a small shrug. She'll accept the settlement. Brooklyn townhouse, monthly support. It's generous. The skyline reflected in the glass behind them. Glass towers, glowing offices, quiet wealth moving silently through private accounts and holding companies. Nathan believed he understood power. He believed power meant visibility. Press interviews, IPO countdowns, strategic marriages. But what he didn't know was that 18% of his pre-IPO shares had quietly shifted into the hands of a private entity 2 days earlier. Hayes Global Holdings. The purchase had been executed through layered subsidiaries routed through Delaware and Zurich. No headlines, no alerts, just a line item in a spreadsheet that hadn't yet reached his desk. As Nathan finished his champagne, confident in his trajectory, Charlotte sat across the river in Brooklyn, rocking her son gently. She wasn't celebrating. She was calculating. Lucas Bennett didn't look like the kind of attorney who challenged Manhattan dynasties. When he walked into Charlotte's Brooklyn apartment, he carried a worn leather briefcase and a winter coat that had seen better seasons. No flashy watch, no Park Avenue polish, just sharp eyes and quiet focus. He paused when he saw the baby sleeping in the bassinet near the window, overlooking the East River. You look exhausted, he said gently. I just gave birth and got divorced in the same hour, Charlotte replied calmly. Exhausted feels appropriate. Lucas allowed himself a small smile. He had graduated near the top of his class from NYU Law. 10 years earlier, he almost dropped out during his second year after his father's medical bills piled up. A private scholarship had appeared anonymously. It covered everything. He later learned, through a single discreet letter, that the donor had been Charlotte Hayes. She never mentioned it. When Andrew called him 2 nights ago, Lucas didn't hesitate. "They're filing for primary custody," Lucas said now, placing documents on the small dining table beside Charlotte's MacBook Air. "Their argument hinges on financial instability." Charlotte nodded. "Which, technically, I have." "For the moment," Lucas corrected. He opened the folder. "I reviewed their petition. They're positioning you as emotionally fragile, recently unemployed, dependent. They're using the IPO narrative to frame Nathan as the stable provider." Charlotte stared at the papers. Words like "best interest of the child" and "financial continuity" were underlined in bold. Lucas leaned back slightly. "They made one mistake." Charlotte looked up. "They assumed you'd react emotionally." A faint breeze moved the sheer curtains near the window. Across the river, the financial district gleamed under winter sun, cold and precise. "I'm not reacting," Charlotte said quietly. "I know." Lucas slid another document toward her. "Temporary counterpetition. We don't reveal Hayes Global yet. We argue procedural overreach and coercive timing, serving divorce papers within hours of childbirth." Charlotte's eyes hardened. "They wanted control," Lucas nodded. "Then let's make this about accountability." Outside, Wall Street tickers moved. Investors refreshed their Bloomberg terminals. Somewhere in a glass tower, Nathan finalized another pre-IPO interview. He believed the battlefield was public. He didn't realize the war had already shifted to courtrooms and boardrooms. And this time, Charlotte wasn't alone. IPO morning arrived with cameras. Nathan stood on the NASDAQ podium in Times Square, the massive curved screen above him flashing CFT in bold white letters against electric blue. Reporters gathered below. Flashbulbs burst in rhythmic waves. He rang the opening bell with controlled confidence. Applause followed. Victoria stood just off stage in a tailored ivory suit, offering a poised smile to financial correspondents. Eleanor watched from a private viewing room, already drafting the next press release in her mind. Carrington FinTech opened strong, up 12% in the first hour. Nathan gave interviews back-to-back, seated in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Midtown. He spoke about digital banking reform, consumer trust, scalable architecture. He spoke about stability. At 11:17 a.m., the first alert appeared on an internal Slack channel. Large block trade executed. 18% institutional shift. Nathan's CFO frowned at his tablet. "That's unusual." "Normal IPO volatility," Nathan replied casually, adjusting his tie. But the buying entity didn't resemble retail enthusiasm. It was coordinated, strategic, routed through a Delaware holding structure few recognized. At 12:03 p.m., another alert. Board seat eligibility triggered. Now Nathan looked up. "What board seat?" he asked sharply. The CFO swallowed. "Whoever holds above 15% qualifies for emergency oversight voting rights." Victoria's smile thinned slightly as she refreshed her phone. By 1:30 p.m., financial blogs began speculating. Who is behind the institutional consolidation? Why is Hayes Global Holdings listed as beneficial interest? Nathan froze. "Hayes," he repeated. The name rang faintly familiar, buried somewhere in old acquisition attempts his mother once mentioned. The stock, once up 12%, began sliding. Down 8. Down 14. Investors hated uncertainty. Nathan's phone vibrated nonstop now. Reporters shifted tone. The CNBC anchor requested clarification about unexpected governance implications. Eleanor stepped into the room, her composure strained. "This is temporary," she said quickly. "We'll contain it." But Nathan wasn't listening. Across the East River, Charlotte sat quietly in her Brooklyn apartment, her son sleeping against her shoulder. Andrew's message appeared on her phone. Voting threshold secured. They can't remove us. Charlotte looked out at the Manhattan skyline, steady and unmoved. Nathan believed power meant standing on a podium. He didn't understand. Real power never rings the bell. By the next morning, financial headlines had shifted tone, from celebration to scrutiny. Who is Hayes Global? Mysterious institutional buyer gains board leverage in Carrington IPO. Governance shock after opening bell success. Nathan hadn't slept. He stood in his glass-walled office overlooking Bryant Park, staring at a Bloomberg terminal as red numbers blinked across the screen. The stock had stabilized overnight, but only barely. Investors were nervous. Analysts were circling. "Set up a call with Hayes Global," he snapped to his assistant. "Now." They declined comment. She replied quietly. Victoria sat on the leather sofa near the window, scrolling through her phone. Her expression had changed overnight. Less admiration. More assessment. "You didn't mention prior exposure to Hayes," she said coolly. "There wasn't any," Nathan insisted. "Not directly." Across town, the Andrew Calloway stepped into a discreet conference room inside Hayes Global's Park Avenue headquarters. The building didn't carry a flashy logo. No press banners. No CNBC cameras. Just quiet wealth. He dialed into Carrington's emergency board session. Nathan's face appeared on screen, tension visible beneath his composure. "Hayes Global now controls 18% of our outstanding shares," the CFO began. "Under governance terms, they qualify for oversight participation." Nathan leaned forward. "On what grounds was this acquisition executed?" Andrew's voice came through steady and unhurried. "Market opportunity." The boardroom fell silent. "Hayes Global is a private institutional entity with long-term investment interests," Andrew continued. "We prefer companies with strong ethical leadership and stable family governance." The words were precise, calculated. Nathan's jaw tightened. "Are you threatening to influence control?" Andrew paused just long enough. "We're safeguarding our investment." Across the East River, Charlotte watched the live financial coverage replay on mute while gently rocking her son. Her phone buzzed with notifications. Legal updates from Lucas, brief status messages from Andrew. Nathan believed visibility gave him leverage. He still didn't understand. Hayes Global didn't chase headlines. It controlled outcomes. And for the first time since serving divorce papers in a hospital room, the Carrington name was no longer the most powerful one in Manhattan. The stock had stopped falling, but the noise hadn't. Charlotte muted the television as another financial analyst speculated about board instability and internal power shifts. The apartment in Brooklyn Heights felt smaller tonight, heavier somehow, as if the weight of Manhattan's opinion had crossed the river. Her son slept in the bassinet beside the couch, one tiny hand resting near his face. His breathing was soft, steady, unaware of IPO charts, custody petitions, or corporate maneuvers. Charlotte hadn't cried in the hospital. She hadn't cried when she left the Carrington townhouse. But now, alone under the dim kitchen light, exhaustion pressed into her bones. Her body still ached from childbirth. Stitches pulled when she stood too quickly. The pain medication sat untouched on the counter beside a cooling cup of Starbucks coffee she'd ordered through delivery earlier, just to feel normal for 5 minutes. Her phone buzzed again. Another legal update from Lucas. The Carrington attorneys were requesting an emergency custody review, citing market volatility and reputational exposure. Reputational exposure. As if she were the scandal. Charlotte picked up her Kindle from the coffee table. She had downloaded Atomic Habits months ago but never finished it. Tonight she opened it randomly, her eyes landing on a sentence about small, consistent actions reshaping identity. She read it twice, then she looked at her son. They think I'm unstable, she whispered softly. They think I'm alone. Her voice didn't tremble, but her hands did. For a brief moment, a fragile, a human moment, she imagined signing the papers, accepting the townhouse, letting Nathan keep control, raising her child quietly somewhere far from Wall Street. No boardrooms, no power struggles, just peace. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Andrew. Additional shares secured. 21% now. They can't outvote us. Charlotte closed her eyes. Peace was not the same as surrender. She stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked across the East River at the glittering financial district. The towers looked calm from a distance, almost beautiful. But she knew what moved inside them. Nathan believed pressure would break her. He didn't understand something essential. She wasn't fighting for valuation. She was fighting for her son's name, and that made her impossible to intimidate. So Charlotte hadn't stepped inside Hayes Global's headquarters in over 3 years. The Park Avenue building didn't carry a flashy logo. No gold letters across the glass. Just a discreet brass plaque near the entrance and a lobby finished in quiet marble. The kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Andrew met her at the elevator. You don't have to stay long, he said gently, glancing at the infant carrier in her hand. I'm not here long, Charlotte replied calmly. I'm here officially. She wore a simple black coat. No dramatic entrance. No photographers waiting outside. The press still didn't know her name. That was about to change. Inside the private boardroom on the 32nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline in pale winter light. Around the long walnut table sat 6 board members, men and women who had worked alongside her father for decades. They stood when she entered, not out of obligation, out of recognition. Andrew placed a thin folder in front of her seat. Beside it rested a Montblanc pen, her father's. She hadn't touched it since his funeral. Contingency Clause 17 has been activated, Andrew announced to the room. Trust restrictions temporarily lifted under protective authority. Charlotte Hayes now holds executive voting control. There was no applause, just silence, heavy with understanding. Charlotte sat down slowly. Across town, Nathan was still in meetings, scrambling to stabilize investor confidence. He believed Hayes Global was maneuvering as an external threat. He still didn't know who he was negotiating against. Andrew turned toward her. One, under current share accumulation, we can request immediate governance review at Carrington FinTech. You would be eligible for an oversight seat. The weight of the moment settled. Charlotte thought about the hospital room, the divorce papers, the word instability. She picked up the Montblanc pen. For a brief second, her hand hovered. Then she signed the authorization form. The skyline outside remained steady, unchanged. But in that quiet boardroom overlooking Park Avenue, control had officially shifted. Nathan had tried to remove her from his future. He had unknowingly written her into his board agenda instead. Nathan's assistant knocked twice before entering. You have an emergency governance notice, she said carefully, placing a printed document on his glass desk. Nathan barely looked up. He was mid-call with 2 institutional investors, reassuring them that volatility was temporary. Send it to legal, he muttered. It's already cleared legal, she replied. They said you need to read it. That caught his attention. He ended the call and picked up the document. Hayes Global Holdings formally requests oversight participation under Section 4.3 Governance Rights, effective immediately. Nathan felt heat rise up his neck. Schedule a response call, he said sharply. I want to know who's behind this. The video conference began an hour later. The Carrington board dialed in from different corners of Manhattan, one from a Park Avenue office, another from a midtown high-rise. Then the Hayes Global screen activated. Andrew Calloway appeared first. Nathan leaned back slightly, recognizing him now from old market history. Mr. Calloway, Nathan began evenly. "We're open to collaboration. But aggressive accumulation without disclosure creates instability." Andrew didn't react. "We've disclosed according to regulatory requirements." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Then who holds executive authority?" There was a pause, and then the camera shifted. Charlotte appeared on screen, not in a hospital bed, not in Brooklyn, but seated at the head of a walnut conference table, Manhattan skyline stretching behind her. She wore a simple navy blazer. No jewelry, no dramatics, just composure. Nathan froze. For a brief second, he actually looked confused. "Charlotte?" he said, voice tightening. "What is this?" She met his gaze calmly. "This is governance." The board members shifted uncomfortably. "You said you wanted stability," she continued. "Hayes Global invests in companies that demonstrate ethical leadership. I'll be reviewing Carrington's executive decisions personally." Victoria, watching from Nathan's office couch, stood abruptly. "You didn't tell me she was—" Nathan silenced her with a sharp glance. "You're threatening my company out of spite?" he demanded. Charlotte's expression didn't change. "No," she said quietly. "I'm protecting my investment." The words landed with surgical precision. Nathan finally understood. The woman he had dismissed as a liability now held oversight power over his IPO. He thought divorce would remove her from the equation. Instead, he had invited her into the boardroom. And this time, she wasn't asking for permission. The custody hearing was scheduled sooner than anyone expected. Eleanor had pushed for urgency, arguing that corporate instability could impact the child's long-term environment. Nathan's legal team arrived early at the Manhattan family courthouse, dressed in tailored gray suits, carrying thick leather portfolios. They looked confident. They assumed leverage still favored them. Charlotte entered quietly through a side corridor with Lucas Bennett beside her. She wore a structured charcoal coat, her posture steady despite the exhaustion beneath her eyes. Her son remained with a licensed pediatric nurse, documented, verified, unshakable. Lucas leaned toward her before they stepped inside the courtroom. "They're going to argue financial inconsistency," he said softly. "Let them." The judge, a woman in her late 50s with sharp, observant eyes, reviewed the initial filings. Nathan's attorney began first. "Your Honor, Mr. Carrington is the stable executive provider of a publicly traded company. Recent market events have created uncertainty tied directly to Mrs. Carrington's involvement. We believe primary custody ensures continuity." Continuity. Charlotte listened without expression. Lucas stood next. "Your Honor, the timing of the divorce filing, within 1 hour of childbirth, demonstrates coercive intent. Additionally, new financial disclosures materially alter the stability argument." He handed a sealed folder to the clerk. The judge opened it slowly. Inside were certified documents: Hayes Global Executive Authorization, voting control confirmation, asset liquidity statements triggered under Clause 17. The courtroom fell quiet. Nathan shifted in his seat. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her handbag. The judge looked up. "Mrs. On Hayes," she said deliberately, using Charlotte's maiden name. "You are the controlling executive authority of Hayes Global Holdings?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And this entity holds oversight leverage in Carrington FinTech?" "Yes." Nathan's attorney attempted to interrupt. The judge raised a hand. "So the argument that you lack financial stability is inaccurate." Lucas spoke clearly. "Not inaccurate, Your Honor. Inverted." A faint ripple moved through the courtroom. Nathan finally spoke, voice strained. "You're using corporate pressure to manipulate custody." Charlotte met his eyes calmly. "I'm using transparency." The judge closed the folder. "Temporary custody remains with the mother," she ruled. "Full review to follow." Nathan had expected dominance. Instead, the foundation of his argument had dissolved in under 10 minutes. For the first time since the hospital room, the Carrington name no longer controlled the narrative. And the courtroom had witnessed it. Eleanor Carrington had never lost in public, not in business, not in charity circles, not in family negotiations conducted behind polished walnut doors. But as she stepped out of the Manhattan courthouse, the air felt thinner. Reporters hadn't been allowed inside, yet financial bloggers were already speculating. A single line from the hearing had leaked. Hayes' global executive authority confirmed. That was enough. Inside the Carrington townhouse on the Upper East Side, silence settled heavily against the high ceilings and curated artwork. Eleanor stood near the fireplace, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. "How did we miss this?" she demanded. "How did no one flag her name?" On the other end, a private investigator answered carefully. Mrs. Hayes never used her family surname publicly. All educational records, employment filings, even charitable donations were under Hayes Trust subsidiaries. Eleanor lowered the phone slowly. Charlotte hadn't deceived them. She had simply refused to announce herself. Across town, Nathan paced inside his Bryant Park office, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. Victoria stood near the window, arms crossed. "You married into a shadow empire and didn't know?" she asked, her tone no longer affectionate. Nathan shot her a sharp look. "No one knew." Victoria let out a short laugh. "That's worse." His phone buzzed again. Another analyst request. Another board inquiry. The Hayes Global had formally requested an internal governance audit of Carrington FinTech's executive decisions during the IPO preparation period. Audit. That word spread faster than any stock fluctuation. Eleanor entered the office minutes later, her composure carefully reconstructed. "We need damage control," she said firmly. "If Hayes calls for executive review, we rally loyal board votes." Nathan hesitated. "They hold 21%, he reminded her quietly. "And we hold reputation," Eleanor snapped. But reputation had begun to crack. An early investor emailed concerns about ethical optics. A venture partner requested a private meeting. The NASDAQ debut that was supposed to cement Carrington legacy now looked fragile. For the first time, Nathan felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not defensiveness, vulnerability. Then he thought divorce would remove Charlotte from his future. Instead, she had re-entered his world not as an ex-wife, but as oversight authority. And somewhere between the courthouse ruling and the audit notice, the Carrington empire had begun to fracture from the inside. The second custody hearing was supposed to be procedural, routine clarification, updated financial disclosures, structured parenting schedules. Nathan arrived composed, wearing a dark tailored suit and the expression of a man reclaiming control. Eleanor sat beside him, posture immaculate, confidence carefully restored. Charlotte entered with Lucas at her side, calm but alert. She hadn't slept much. Her son was now 6 weeks old, growing stronger every day. So was she. Nathan's attorney opened with renewed force. "Your Honor, while Mrs. Hayes possesses financial resources, recent actions demonstrate a conflict of interest. She is using corporate leverage to destabilize Mr. Carrington's professional standing. That instability affects the child." The argument was smoother this time, sharper. Lucas waited until the statement finished. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "we would like to introduce supplementary documentation obtained during governance review." He handed a sealed envelope to the clerk. Nathan frowned. "What documentation?" he demanded quietly. Lucas didn't answer him. He waited for the judge to open the file. Inside were printed internal emails from Carrington FinTech's executive server, recovered during Hayes Global's audit. The judge read silently for several long seconds. Then she looked up. "Mr. Carrington," she said slowly, "did you write this?" Nathan's face drained of color. The email, or dated 3 weeks before Charlotte gave birth, read clearly, "If divorce proceedings are initiated before IPO filing, asset separation simplifies optics. Custody should default to the Carrington name to avoid dilution risk." The courtroom felt suddenly smaller. Nathan shifted in his seat. That was strategic language, taken out of context. The judge continued reading. Another line. "Emotional timing post-delivery increases compliance probability." Eleanor inhaled sharply. Charlotte did not react outwardly, but inside, something settled permanently. This wasn't about incompatibility. It wasn't even about betrayal. It was calculation. Lucas spoke calmly. "Your Honor, this demonstrates premeditated manipulation tied directly to the timing of childbirth." The judge closed the folder. "Temporary sole custody remains with Mrs. Hayes," she ruled firmly. "Further review will consider ethical conduct." Nathan had tried to argue instability. Instead, his own words exposed intent. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. For the first time, the narrative shifted. Not toward wealth, but toward character. And Nathan's had just been entered into public record. The courtroom was quieter this time, not tense, not dramatic, just watchful. Charlotte sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture steady, her hands folded loosely in front of her. Lucas reviewed notes beside her, but neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Nathan looked different today, less polished. The headlines about the internal email had spread through financial media like wildfire. CNBC had softened its tone, and analysts had begun using words like governance concern and leadership scrutiny. Reputation was fragile, and Nathan was beginning to feel it. The judge requested an updated parenting assessment from the court-appointed family specialist. The report was neutral, structured schedules, supervised transitional visits, gradual familiarity. No accusations, just facts. Then the specialist added something unexpected. "Your Honor, during the observed visit, the infant displayed immediate physical recognition of the mother's presence, calm breathing, direct eye tracking, responsive cooing. The father's interaction was appropriate, but limited in duration." Nathan shifted uncomfortably. Charlotte didn't move. The judge nodded slowly. "We are not evaluating corporate strategy. We are evaluating attachment." That word lingered. Attachment. But Lucas spoke gently. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hayes has demonstrated consistent primary caregiving since birth. The timing of the divorce filing created unnecessary emotional disruption during a medically vulnerable period." Nathan's attorney attempted to reframe the argument. But then something small happened. Charlotte's son, seated quietly in the infant carrier beside her chair, stirred awake, his tiny face wrinkled in confusion for a brief moment. Charlotte leaned down instinctively. "It's okay," she whispered softly. The baby reached upward, without hesitation, gripping her finger tightly. The room stilled. The judge observed carefully. There were no theatrics, no speeches, just instinct. Nathan watched the moment unfold, something unreadable flickering across his face. He had prepared arguments about legacy, about surname, about financial continuity. But he hadn't prepared for this. The judge closed the file. "Primary physical custody remains with the mother," she ruled firmly. "Mr. Carrington will receive structured visitation." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive, but it was decisive. And for the first time since that hospital room, the only thing that mattered wasn't power. It was presence. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. No press, no live stream, just 12 voting members seated around the long glass table inside Carrington FinTech's headquarters overlooking Bryant Park. Nathan arrived early, carrying a leather folder he hadn't needed in years. For the first time since the IPO launch, the hallway felt colder. Employees avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when he passed. He told himself it was temporary. The markets fluctuate. Headlines fade. But governance votes leave scars. Charlotte did not attend in person. She didn't need to. Her presence appeared on the wall-sized screen at exactly 8:02 a.m., connected from Hayes Global's Park Avenue boardroom. Andrew Calloway sat to her right, silent but observant. Nathan met her gaze across digital space. "Let's proceed," the lead independent director said firmly. The agenda was direct. Review of executive conduct during IPO preparation, assessment of reputational risk, vote of confidence in current leadership. Nathan spoke first. "I built this company from the ground up," he said evenly. "Temporary optics should not erase performance." One board member cleared her throat. "It's not optics," she said carefully. "It's governance integrity." Another added, "The internal email exposed strategic intent that conflicts with ethical leadership standards." Nathan's jaw tightened. "You're overreacting to language." Charlotte finally spoke. Her voice was calm, not emotional. "Language reveals priorities." Silence followed. The independent director summarized the findings. Stock volatility triggered by undisclosed exposure risk. Investor confidence shaken. Audit recommendation unresolved. Then came the vote. One by one, 12 voices. 6 in favor of leadership transition. 2 abstained. 4 opposed. The majority was clear. Nathan felt the weight before the words were spoken. "Effective immediately," the director said. "Mr. Carrington will step down as CEO pending further review." The room stayed still. No applause, no celebration, just consequence. And Victoria had already distanced herself publicly 2 days earlier. Eleanor was not present. She had chosen not to witness the outcome. Nathan looked at the screen again. Charlotte didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded once. He had tried to remove her from his life. Instead, she had removed him from his own boardroom. The Plaza Hotel glittered under crystal chandeliers the way it always had, unchanged by scandal, immune to headlines. The annual Children's Financial Literacy Gala had not been canceled. In Manhattan, events never stopped for personal collapse. Charlotte stepped out of a black car onto Fifth Avenue just after sunset. The winter air was sharp, but she didn't flinch. She wore a deep midnight blue Dior gown, elegant, structured, understated. No diamonds, no excess. Power didn't need decoration. Lucas Bennett stepped out behind her in a tailored tuxedo, offering his arm not as display, but as steady presence. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with old money and controlled whispers. Investment bankers, hedge fund founders, philanthropists, the kind of room Nathan once commanded effortlessly. Tonight, the room shifted when Charlotte entered, not loudly, but noticeably. Andrew Calloway was already waiting near the stage, speaking quietly with 2 trustees. When Charlotte approached, conversation softened. "She's here," someone murmured. "She's Hayes," another whispered. Across the room, Nathan stood near the bar, no longer introduced as CEO, only as founder. The distinction mattered. He wore a dark suit, but something about him felt diminished. Victoria was not present. Eleanor remained absent from public events until further notice. Charlotte didn't avoid him. She didn't approach him either. Instead, she walked toward the podium when her name was announced. "Tonight," the host said carefully, "we welcome Charlotte Hayes, Executive Chair of Hayes Global Holdings." There was a pause, then applause, not explosive, respectful, measured. Charlotte took the microphone calmly. "My son was born 6 weeks ago," she began, "and he deserves a world where financial literacy is taught with integrity, not manipulation." The room went still. "This year, Hayes Global will establish a fund supporting single parents rebuilding after coercive financial litigation. It wasn't revenge. It was architecture. Nathan watched her speak, steady, composed, untouchable. He had tried to frame her as instability. Now she stood framed by gold, light, and legacy. Manhattan watched carefully, and for the first time, the Carrington name was no longer the headline. She was. The Gala had ended, but Manhattan never truly went quiet. Outside the plaza, black cars lined Fifth Avenue, engines humming softly beneath winter air. Guests filtered out in controlled clusters, their conversations subdued but charged. Charlotte stepped onto the marble steps, Lucas a few feet behind her, giving her space without leaving her alone. Charlotte. She knew the voice before she turned. Nathan stood near the curb, hands in his coat pockets. No entourage, no photographers, just him. The city lights reflected faintly in his eyes, but the sharp certainty she once knew was gone. "Can we talk?" he asked. Lucas glanced at her. "I'll be over there," he said quietly, stepping aside but remaining within view. Charlotte faced Nathan fully. "You have 5 minutes." He nodded once. "I made mistakes," he began. "Not defensive, not calculated, just tired. I thought I was protecting growth. I thought I was building something that required hard decisions." "You called it strategic," she replied evenly. His jaw tightened. "I didn't think you'd fight." "I didn't fight," she corrected softly. "I responded." The distinction hung between them. Nathan exhaled slowly. "The board removed me this morning, officially." "I know. You orchestrated it." "No," she said calmly. "Your email did." Silence followed. Traffic moved. A distant siren echoed somewhere down Central Park South. "I underestimated you," he admitted finally. Charlotte studied him for a moment, not with hatred, not with triumph, with clarity. You didn't underestimate me," she said quietly. "You misjudged my value." He looked down briefly. "I never wanted this to become a war." "It wasn't a war," she replied. "It was consequence." Nathan searched her face for something. Anger, softness, regret. He found none. "What happens now?" he asked. "You rebuild," she said simply, "without manipulation." "And us?" Charlotte's expression didn't waver. "There is no us. There is our son." She turned toward Lucas, who stepped forward without hesitation. Nathan remained on the curb as the car door closed. For the first time in his life, he understood something money couldn't reverse. Some losses don't come from markets. They come from character. 6 months later, Manhattan had moved on. Markets recovered. Headlines shifted. New scandals replaced old ones. But Hayes Global did not retreat. Under Charlotte's leadership, the firm announced a strategic expansion into ethical fintech oversight, quietly acquiring distressed assets that had once orbitated Carrington Fintech. Not as revenge, as recalibration. Her office on Park Avenue remained understated. No oversized nameplates, no media walls, just floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the steady rhythm of Midtown. Her son now laughed easily. He had her eyes. Charlotte balanced him on her hip one afternoon as she reviewed quarterly projections on her MacBook. Numbers rose steadily. Controlled growth, sustainable positioning. Andrew entered with a thin folder. "Final acquisition paperwork," he said. "Carrington's remaining voting shares have been redistributed. The board is stabilizing." Charlotte nodded once. Nathan had not disappeared entirely. He retained minority equity, though stripped of authority. His public appearances were limited, rebuilding quietly. Eleanor's social calendar had thinned. Victoria had aligned herself elsewhere. Consequences had unfolded without spectacle. That evening, Charlotte walked through Central Park with Lucas, pushing a stroller beneath bare winter trees. The city felt different now. Not hostile, not demanding. Balanced. Lucas glanced at her gently. "You didn't destroy him." "No," she said. "He did that himself." They walked in silence for a moment. "I never thanked you," he added quietly. "For law school." Charlotte smiled faintly. "You paid it back." He stopped walking. "Not fully." She looked up at him. Lucas wasn't dramatic. He wasn't theatrical. But his steadiness had never wavered. "I don't want to stand beside you because you're powerful," he said calmly. "I want to stand beside you because you're principled." The words were simple, honest. Charlotte felt something unfamiliar, but welcome. Not urgency, not pressure. Peace. Across the skyline, glass towers reflected fading sunlight. The same towers that once symbolized conflict now felt distant. She hadn't won a war. She had reclaimed her life, and this time she chose partnership, not out of strategy, but out of respect. 1 year later, the skyline looked the same, but everything else had changed. Charlotte stood in her Park Avenue office, her son balanced against her shoulder, as late afternoon sunlight poured through the glass. Manhattan moved below. Yellow taxis weaving through traffic, traders exiting towers, headlines refreshing across digital billboards. Hayes Global had just released its annual report. Strong returns, and zero governance violations, expanded oversight investments. The firm's new initiative, the Hayes Foundation for Ethical Family Advocacy, had already funded legal aid for dozens of parents facing coercive financial litigation. Quietly, effectively. Not revenge, restoration. Her assistant stepped in softly. "Your 4 p.m. is here." Charlotte nodded. Nathan entered moments later. He looked different, not defeated, just humbled. His suit was simpler now. No Rolex, no entourage. He carried only a small folder. Their son, now walking with careful confidence, ran toward him without hesitation. Nathan knelt immediately. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, voice unguarded. There were no cameras, no board votes, no strategic positioning, just a father learning patience. Charlotte watched the moment carefully. She had not erased him from their child's life. Well, she had drawn boundaries, and boundaries had rebuilt something healthier. Nathan stood slowly. "I finalized the education trust," he said. "Fully funded. In his name." Charlotte nodded once. "Thank you." Silence settled. Not awkward, not heavy. Mature. "I misjudged what mattered," Nathan said quietly. "I know," she replied. Outside the window, the city reflected gold. Lucas entered shortly after, carrying takeout containers from a small Italian place they both liked. No dramatic entrances. No diamond proposals under chandeliers. Just steadiness. Charlotte looked at her son, then at the skyline beyond him. They had tried to reduce her to instability. They had tried to silence her with paperwork. Instead, she built structure. She built integrity. She built a future where her child carried both names, Hayes and Carrington, without shame. Because legacy isn't about dominance. It's about what survives when pride falls away. And hers had survived everything. And just like that, our story comes to a close. If you are still here with me right now, truly still here, then something in this journey must have touched your heart in some way. Maybe it wasn't the wealth. Maybe it wasn't the boardrooms or the headlines. Maybe it was the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let humiliation define her future. Let's pause together and look at this from a deeper angle. Charlotte didn't win because she was rich. She won because she chose dignity over revenge, structure over chaos, and responsibility over ego. That's something we can all carry into our own lives. The Stoics believed that we cannot control what happens to us, only how we respond. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength." That's exactly what she did. She didn't react. She responded. Sometimes people will underestimate you. Sometimes they'll mistake your silence for weakness. But integrity, patience, and self-control are forms of power that don't fade when circumstances shift. And when you build from character instead of pride, what you create lasts. If this story meant something to you, if you felt seen, understood, or inspired even a little, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay with us. More stories are waiting. This story is a fictional narrative created for emotional storytelling and entertainment purposes. While it reflects realistic themes such as divorce, corporate governance, custody disputes, and financial power dynamics, the characters, companies, and events portrayed are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real individuals, organizations, or legal cases is purely coincidental. The financial structures, legal procedures, and corporate mechanisms described are simplified for narrative clarity and dramatic effect. This content does not intend to provide legal, financial, or investment advice, nor does it represent actual corporate entities or real-life events. The purpose of this story is to explore themes of resilience, integrity, accountability, and personal growth within a dramatized setting. Viewers are encouraged to interpret it as a work of fiction designed to inspire reflection, rather than as a factual account or documentary representation of real-world business or legal practices.